because of too much stress, so he walked onto the stage like a log, his limbs stiff. When friends and family saw this, they immediately burst into joyful laughter. But his father felt deeply embarrassed. Then when the bride stepped onto the stage, that another issue also occurs, because her father accidentally stepped on her dress, causing the bride to fall to the floor before taking a few steps. However, despite this, when the bride saw the groom's panicked expression, she felt very happy. A radiant smile appeared on her face, and thus their wedding came to an end. After going through numerous awkward incidents, they had originally thought that life after marriage would be blissfully happy and fulfilling, but reality turned out to be quite harsh. Jinju was a woman that was entirely devoted to her child. She stayed with the child all day. Even when she went to the bathroom, the child would cry continuously outside the door. So Jinju had no choice but to hold the child while using the bathroom. However, after witnessing the scene, her husband turned around and complained her instead, asking why she had to bring the child along to the toilet. Hearing his words, Jinju felt too disheartened to reply. Then when she was about to take a teaspoon of hot rice, the baby's cries once again interrupted everything. Having no other choice, Jinju held the child while eating a bland bowl of rice with flowing tears in heart. Carrying the child for extended periods of time caused her arms to ache, but she had no choice. The light in the house had been broken for a long time, but her husband didn't care. While at working place, he was overly enthusiastic instead. As Jinju pushed her child along the street, she envied the other women she saw. But in return, she received completely different looks from them because her clothes were stained from feeding her child. When she noticed the stain, Jinju tried to wipe it off with saliva, but clearly that didn't work at all. Watching people pass by on the street, it reminded her that she too was once a beautiful young woman, but in just a few short years, she had transformed into what others saw as a middle-aged woman. At night, because the baby had eaten something unclean, it kept vomiting continuously. Seeing her child in such discomfort, Jinju was extremely heartbroken. In a moment of panic, she could only hurriedly call her husband. But at that moment, Ban-do was busy drinking and singing with his colleagues, completely ignoring the sound of the ringing phone. With no other choice, Jinju had to take her child to the hospital for a checkup by herself. Watching her baby lying on the bed, Jinju could only keep saying, "I'm sorry, my dear," because she had rushed to the hospital so quickly, she didn't even have time to change her slippers. But fortunately, the baby didn't have any serious issues. After returning home, she accidentally saw a credit card bill on the table. Upon opening it, she discovered it was filled with hotel payment transactions. Just at that moment, Jinju's phone suddenly rang. It turned out to be her best friend who had sent her a photo. The man in the photo was her husband. Seeing that photo, Jinju's heart instantly shattered, causing her to collapse to the floor. She couldn't believe that her husband was that kind of person. But when she looked up and saw herself in the mirror, it seemed that she understood everything. The current version of herself was sloppy and disheveled, and when she walked down the street, people mistook her for an old aunt. Thinking of this, Jinju's tears began to fall. At that moment, Ban-do sent her a message, saying he wouldn't be coming home tonight. Seeing the message, Jinju's already aching heart almost stopped beating. When a wife knows her husband has another woman, she completely loses control of her emotions. She didn't understand what she had done wrong. In her despair and helplessness, she called her husband, Ban-do, asking him why he treated her like this, why he did this to her. Her husband's attitude was extremely indifferent upon hearing her words. He even turned around and blamed her. He said, "What about me? Do you even know how I'm treated out there? I'm not even treated as well as a dog. Do you know what I've had to endure?" Then he assumed that his life turned upside down because he had met her. After Jinju heard her husband's words, finally she decided to make the heartbreaking words. She told her husband to divorce her, saying that they were not happy living together, and they shouldn't have met each other from the beginning. At this moment, Ban-do was also completely devastated. He didn't even know what exactly he had done wrong, but in reality, everything he had already done was wrong. Earlier on their wedding anniversary, Jinju had always hoped Ban-do would remember this day, but he couldn't say a word. Then Jinju went back to the room. Seeing a gift box hanging on Ban-do's bag, she mistakenly thought it was an anniversary gift for her. But when Ban-do saw it, he hurriedly rushed over to stop her from touching it. It turned out the gift was for the company leader's wife. Seeing the husband treating so coldly, Jinju in anger moment took Ban-do's notebook, preparing to throw it into the water basin. That notebook was more precious to Ban-do than his own life, because the notes inside were all about the leader's preferences and the tasks that needed to be done next. But Jinju, now enraged to the point of madness, didn't care about any of that. She even said, "Am I supposed to rely on this notebook to make a living? Even if I went out and sold gum on the street, I would still earn more than you." Jinju scolded him a useless and stingy man. After hearing that, Ban-do immediately flew into a rage. He said if anything happened to the notebook, they would get divorced. Hearing these words, Jinju stood there stunned, causing the notebook to fall into the basin of water. After that, no matter how much Ban-do tried to salvage it, the writing writing in the notebook was still blurred by the water, that making it unwritable, causing Bando to miss out on his leader's work. In order to restore his image in the eyes of the leader, he had no choice but to drink alcohol while slapping his own face to apologize. Not only that, whenever the leader encountered a problem, he would immediately use Bando as a cannon fodder. That night, the hospital director, in order to prevent his wife from discovering he had another woman outside, told Bando to take her away. But while standing on the street, the woman stubbornly refused to leave. At that moment, the director's wife appeared and rushed in to hit the woman. Bando, trying to intervene, was choked by the director's wife. As he struggled to resist, he accidentally pushed her to the ground, and coincidentally, this scene was witnessed by the director. The director immediately rushed over and punched Bando. Afterward, when the director and Bando sat together drinking, the director said he had no choice but to use force. But in Bando's heart, the director's actions had crossed the line. Bando went to the bathroom and extremely angry. Then he planned to confront the director. But the moment he opened the door, all those thoughts were crushed by reality. He still had to grovel, bow down, and smile in front of the other person. When he heard the director mock him over and over again, he could only give a foolish smile to brush it off. Afterward, Bando sat in the car, looking at the injury on his face, not daring to go home. So he told his wife that he wouldn't be coming home that night. And it was exactly this sentence that made Jinju misunderstand, thinking that he had someone else outside. What followed was the scene at the beginning of the video. One person refused to ask, the other refused to speak. The next day, Bando and Jinju went to the courthouse to go through the divorce procedures. Right after completing the divorce, Bando wanted to say a few words to end the relationship peacefully, but Jinju, who having already been deeply, was disappointed in him, only responded with sarcastic and mocking words. However, even so, when the two were about to go their separate ways, Bando still said, "I hope you will be happy." A couple who was once very happy ended up getting divorced simply because one didn't ask and the other didn't speak, in the end leading to their separation. That year, after returning home from the divorce, Bando looked at the ring on his hand, feeling very uncomfortable, so he took the ring off and threw it hard out of the window. Meanwhile, Jinju was sitting on the bus looking at her wedding ring. After gazing at it for a long time, she finally loosened her grip and let the ring to fall onto the road. But it was also these two rings that created an immense magical force, causing a powerful earthquake at Bando and Jinju's residence, and it was this earthquake that sent the two of them back in time. The next morning, Bando went to the grocery store to buy breakfast, but when seeing the expiration date on the food on the shelf, he was astonished because it was marked 1999. So he turned to ask the shopkeeper, but she looked at it and said it was the newest stock available. At that moment, Bando looked up and noticed that the shopkeeper suddenly appeared much younger. His reaction also left the shopkeeper confused and not understanding what was happening, until Bando saw himself in the mirror. He couldn't believe it. He didn't understand why his face had suddenly become so young, so he hurried home to find his mother. When Bando saw his parents' faces appearing in the house, he could no longer believe his eyes. Then he looked over and discovered that the calendar hanging on the wall was also 1999. Meanwhile, Jinju just waking up and saw her deceased mother appear before her, looking at her mother's face. Jinju could not believe her eyes. She always thought it was just a dream, but even if it was a dream, Jinju still sadly embraced her mother. Also, she apologized to her mother for not having had the chance to tell her yesterday that she had gotten a divorce. She also wanted to live happily, but now it had turned out like this. Jinju wanted to leave the world to follow her mother. Hearing her daughter's words, the mother was confused and didn't understand what was happening. She even mistakenly thought that Jinju was cursing her to die, so she turned around and scolded Jinju. At this moment, Jinju also realized the issue. She hit herself and felt pain. The mother, seeing her daughter like this, thought she was possessed by a ghost and quickly moved in to hit her a few more times. It was then that Jinju understood this might not be a dream. Afterward, she looked at herself in the mirror and discovered that she had become much younger. The calendar on the wall had also changed to 1999. The clothes in the closet had become school clothes, and the bookshelf was full of novels she had read as a student. At this moment, Jinju realized that she had traveled back in time. The beautiful time that had been lost was now back, making Jinju know that she had to cherish it even more. So no matter what her mother did, she would stick close behind, because it had been a long time since she had enjoyed the happiness of having her mother by her side. Thinking back to the past when she looked at her mother's portrait at the funeral home, she had felt a deep sense of guilt and self-blame. Now that her mother was right in front of her, it made her extremely happy, but in her mother's eyes, she thought Jinju was intentionally clinging to her to get her to buy a new phone for her. So the mother, to dispel this thought of her daughter, told her husband to quickly take her to school. When Jinju saw the university gates, a sense of familiarity suddenly washed over her. Meanwhile, Bando, after realizing that he had traveled back in time, was very excited. preparing to take his bag to school. But just as Bando was very enthusiastic, his father was unable to tolerate this unusual behavior, so he went over and hit Bandon repeatedly, thinking that his son had a mental issue. Bando looked at the situation before him, and only then dared to believe that he had truly traveled back in time. Afterward, he also went to the gates of the university he had once attended, after divorcing her husband. The next day, Jinju woke up to find that she had traveled back to 20 years ago. Moreover, she had returned to the university, both unfamiliar and familiar. But the person who also traveled back to the past with her was her useless husband. When the two of them met again at the university, both were shocked and wide-eyed, facing the person they once lived with day and night. But in their hearts, there was only the scene of their divorce. Thinking of this, neither wanted to repeat that past again. Both continued to walk towards each other, but when they were about to face each other, they merely passed by like two strangers. Seeing this, Bando felt pleased, thinking that Jinju did not recognize him at this moment, while Jinju was also happy, because Bando still did not recognize her. She even hoped that she would never know him in this lifetime. She suddenly saw a handsome guy appear on the soccer field, and this handsome guy had once confessed his feelings to her, but unfortunately she had rejected him. Now looking back, Jinju began to regret. At this moment, the handsome guy Namgil also suddenly noticed that Jinju was staring at him. Namgil immediately turned his head to avoid Jinju's gaze, but when Jinju saw this, she wondered if Namgil was shy to meet her. Just as Jinju was still daydreaming, her best friend Bo-rom suddenly came looking for her. Seeing her 18-year-old best friend, Jinju was extremely excited, continuously stroking Bo-rom's face, making her think that Jinju's mind was not right. Then Bo-rom dragged Jinju to the lecture hall. Here Jinju saw the handsome guy on the soccer field again, because 20 years ago she had missed the chance once. This time she was determined not to miss this great opportunity. She took the initiative to greet Namgil. Everyone who saw this scene was astonished, especially the expressions of the other female students, when seeing Jinju were angrily full of gritted teeth. After all, Namgil was the object of admiration for all the female students in the school. But when Namgil saw Jinju come over to greet him, he found it very amusing. Then Bo-rom recounted everything to Jinju. It turned out that last night Namgil had confessed his feelings to Jinju in front of many other female students. But the reason Jinju rejected him was because he smelled strongly of sweat. Hearing this, Namgil was very embarrassed. Upon hearing her best friend's recount, Jinju couldn't believe she had said such things. Now she truly felt regret. But when Bo-rom witnessed Jinju's unusual reaction throughout the day, she was also very worried. Jinju reluctantly had to explain that she had time traveled from 20 years later back to this time, but her best friend didn't believe it at all. So she explained that she had time traveled from 20 years later and even back to the day after the divorce. After hearing Jinju's story, both of her best friends thought that she must be crazy, so the two of them went out for a meal together, leaving Jinju alone. Seeing her best friend's attitude like this, Jinju also felt very helpless and eventually had no choice but to go with them for a meal. But as Jinju was on her way to the dining hall, a hand suddenly grabbed her. Here Jinju's romantic fortune continuously appeared. First, a handsome guy at school confessed his feelings to her. The young man said he had been paying attention to Jinju for a long time and wanted to ask for her phone number. Hearing this, Jinju felt very happy, but she had just time traveled, so she forgot whether she had a phone or not. When she told the young man that she didn't have a phone number and didn't remember the landline number, the sound of a text message notification suddenly rang out. The young man's positive attitude immediately disappeared upon hearing this. As Jinju was preparing to explain, the young man had already turned and left without a glance back. However, the friends who saw this scene immediately showed expressions of jealousy, but in contrast to Jinju, who was immersed in her romantic fortune, her husband Bando was in a miserable state. Since time traveling to the university era, Bando was like a teenager. Everything in his eyes became very strange, especially when he saw the clothes his friend Jae-woo was wearing. He even mocked the others for their strange dress, asking if they were dressed up as chicks. Jae-woo also asked Bondon that whether he hadn't been wearing it, and Bando dared to mock him. Bando then said that he would never wear such a thing, but after Bando said this and entered the classroom, he discovered that the chick costume he had mocked was actually the class's uniform, and he was the only one not wearing it. The class monitor saw that Bando wasn't in uniform, immediately reprimanded him. However, Bando thought in his mind that this guy actually dared mount the high horse and insist that he follow what he said. After thinking for a moment, he ended up laughing out loud. The class monitor felt very uncomfortable seeing him laugh. Moreover, Bando straightforwardly said that he had been in a hurry and forgot to wear it. The class monitor then asked him if he knew why everyone had to stand here and be punished. A Kwitong student said that it was because a new student in their department had beaten up a senior. Bandu then passionately criticized the classmates for being so arrogant, saying that they even dared to hit a senior, didn't know what respect was. The class monitor monitor could no longer tolerate it after hearing this, then said that it was Ban Dawn. It turned out that last night, while Ban Do was having dinner with other classmates, he heard the seniors say that their uniform was a chick costume, which made him very angry. So a conflict occurred with those seniors, and that's why they had to be punished today. One person's mistake means the whole group has to share the responsibility. And at this time, the seniors who were beaten last night had come with sticks full of momentum to the classroom, wanting to teach Bando a lesson. After these seniors entered the classroom, they yelled in a fierce tone, wanting Bando to come out and meet them. After that, Bando and the other students were punished by the seniors with a stance exercise, and had to listen to the seniors' hollow scolding. Not long after, a student told the seniors that he could no longer endure it, asking how much longer they had to hold this stance. The seniors said that as long as no female student entered the room, they would have to maintain the position. But where would the civil engineering department find any female students? Just then, coincidentally, that a girl with long hair down to her waist suddenly appeared in the hallway, causing everyone's eyes to follow her figure outside the door. They kept hoping that this girl would open the door and come in, but what everyone didn't expect happened. When the classmates saw this boy, even the thought of wanting to leave this world appeared in their minds. But Bando was poked fun by this waist-length haired guy that he cannot stop laughing to the point of being unable to close one's mouth. This inadvertent laughter further fueled the anger of the seniors, leading them to continue their punishment of Bando. Soon after the punishment ended, Bando, wanting to comfort his brothers, specially bought drinks for them. However, as they just left the building, a figure passed by, making Bando feel an odd sense of familiarity. So he followed the person, and it turned out that this boy was Bando's superior, who had previously used him as a cannon fodder. Now encountering him in the school, Bando certainly wouldn't let him off. While Hun Sut was talking with his girlfriend, Bando went up and pretended to accidentally knock him over, then took out a can of soda as an apology. However, this can of soda was not simple. When he and Suk opened, it turned out that Bando had been shaking it continuously while walking on the road, only to vent his anger. Then when Bando returned to the classroom, a classmate told him, "Tonight there will be a meet and greet with female classmates." Bando was extremely pleased to hear this, but before he could enjoy the news, when he turned around, the first thing he saw was his ex-wife, Jinju. Two people looked at each other, secretly hoping they would never see each other again in this life. But what neither of them expected was that, the communicating activities in the evening, they would again be seated at the same table. When they looked at each other, both thought that the other had not traveled back with them. However, what annoyed them even more was that the classmates suggested playing a pairing game. At first, Jinju and Bando wanted to avoid each other, but fate played a cruel joke on them, and they ended up being paired with each other. As they looked at each other, they couldn't understand why the more they looked, the more irritated they felt. When Bando thought about his future predicament, he wanted to escape quickly, so he used a mocking tone to reject Jinju. But Jinju was not to be outdone, and immediately retaliated against Bando mercilessly. But just as Bando was about to leave, he didn't forget to say, "Today, I'm breaking up with you." After saying this, he turned and left. Jinju, upon hearing this, was left stunned and not understanding what he meant, and when she realized the implication of his words, she felt very uncomfortable. She couldn't understand why. She ended up loving such a childish man. As Bando left, he was still secretly pleased, because he finally won against Jinju once. But before he could not even enjoy for very long, he ran into his first love. Seeing her silhouette and that beautiful face immediately left him speechless, so he hurriedly chased after her and pulled her nearer, asking if she remembered him. So-young replied that she did, but not very well. Bando immediately responded that it didn't matter. He looked intently at her, and a happy smile instantly appeared on his face. But coincidentally this scene was also witnessed by Jinju. Seeing her ex-husband treating another woman so gallantly, Jinju felt very jealous inside. Even though they were divorced, she still couldn't accept. In the end, she could only turn and walk away. As Jinju wandered along the bridge, she thought that Bando had traveled back in time, was to find his first love. But if he loved his first love so much, why had he stayed with her for so many years? Thinking about this made her mood very bad. At this moment, what made things even worse was that Jinju seemed to hear her child's voice. In her daze, she even saw her own child appearing on the bridge, but in reality, that child was someone else's. This caused Jinju's emotions to completely spiral out of control, and she burst into tears. Although she had traveled back to the past, but she was a mother, she still deeply missed and worried about her child. In thinking about what her child might be going through, she sincerely hoped that this time travel was just a dream, because she really missed her child. Thinking over and over again, Jinju eventually couldn't control herself, collapsing on the bridge, sobbing uncontrollably. Then she walked to a taxi, crying as she opened the door and got in. But this car wasn't a taxi, it was the handsome Namgil's car. Seeing Jinju so upset, Namgil didn't know what to do, so in the end he just drove her home. On the way, in an attempt to help Jinju feel better, He even specially opened a song, hoping that the song could calm her down. But throughout the entire ride, Jinju's tears never stopped falling. It wasn't until Nam-gil brought her to her doorstep that he finally spoke a sentence, telling her that she had arrived. Hearing this, Jinju absent-mindedly pulled out a bank card and handed it to Nam-gil, and when Nam-gil saw the card, his face froze in surprise. Then he handed the card back to her. Jinju, still crying, took the bank card and stepped out of the car. As Nam-gil watched her walk away, he still couldn't understand what she had been through. After she arrived home, Jinju opened the farewell letter she had written to her mother long ago, because she considered that just by sleeping, there was a good chance she might time travel back to the future. Then she went to the living room and knelt in front of her mother, looking at her with innocent eyes. She really wanted her mother to stay with her forever. As for the mother, when seeing her daughter like that, she had no idea what was wrong with her. That night, the mother lay in bed and asked her husband if she had accidentally given her something wrong to eat. While Jinju was lying right next to her mother, saw her mother turning to look at her and said, just seeing her made her so happy. Then Jinju was like a little child laying in her mother's arms. Perhaps in the eyes of a mother, no matter how old her children get, they are still her little ones. On the other side, even though it was already midnight, Bando was still sitting in his room, deeply pondering whether if he went to sleep, he would time travel back. If that happened, he would become a divorced man. Life wouldn't be as enjoyable as at the moment. To prevent himself from falling asleep, Bandu resorted to using 2 matchsticks to prop open the corners of his eyes, to stop himself from drifting off. But in the end, he still fell asleep in widening open eyes state. The next morning, Jinju realized that she hadn't time traveled back to the future, and because she had cried so much the night before, her eyes had now become red and swollen. As for Bando, after he woke up, realizing that he hadn't returned to the future, he was ecstatic to the point of going crazy. However, this also gave him an idea, so he called the whole family together and told his parents to hand over all the family assets to him, that he could multiply that money several times over, so that everyone can live a life of wealth and luxury. Just invest the money in Chinese real estate, and its value will increase many times in the future. But after hearing this, his parents were so furious they nearly fainted. His father was unable to take it anymore, that grabbed a hammer, intending to teach his son a lesson to wake him up. However, the son still didn't seem to have come to his senses. Seeing that his father was truly angry at him this time, he hurriedly ran out of the house. Meanwhile, Jinju was in a taxi on her way to school. When the taxi reached the school gate, Jinju handed the driver a bank card. The driver, however, froze in confusion, and he said, this was a taxi, not a supermarket where she could swipe your card. But Jinju clearly remembered that she could swipe the card just fine the night before, so why wasn't it working today? With no other option, Jinju started rummaging through her bag to find some cash for the driver, but no matter how hard she searched, she couldn't find a single coin. Finally, she remembered that she had accidentally dropped her wallet in the taxi last night. Luckily, she found the last 5.000 won in her jacket pocket and handed it to the driver. After she had just stepped into the school, what caught her eye was that handsome guy Nam-gil. Seeing Nam-gil walking towards her, Jinju was terrified and quickly hid behind a trash can, quietly watching Nam-gil from afar. Just as Jinju was gazing at him admiringly, Bando's close friend and his group of buddies also arrived, but Jinju, not wanting to be exposed, kicked her leg to chase them away. Coincidentally, this scene was witnessed by Nam-gil. He thought to himself why he kept encountering this strange girl. Thinking of that, Nam-gil hurriedly left. Seeing Nam-gil leave, only then did Jinju dare to let out a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, ever since he traveled back in time, Bando had resolved to pursue his secret love, the goddess So-young. While So-young was practicing her dance, Bando secretly stood at the back door watching her. Seeing So-young passionately practicing her dance, Bando felt incredibly excited inside. He thought to himself that if from the beginning he and So-young had been together, then the days ahead would probably be very happy. Because of this, Bando decided to muster all his courage. Walked up to So-young. He told So-young that he was very sorry for being so rude last night. Today he came to apologize. Here's a drink he bought just for her. Of course, there's also some for her other friends. After saying that, Do was about to leave, but after taking just a few steps that he turned around and said whether he could get her phone number. Next time we meet, they would already be familiar with each other. After that, when Bando went to tell this story to his close friends, none of them dared to believe him and consider that he was lying. Dokjae even dialed the number to verify it when he heard that the person answering was So-young. The two friends finally fully believed the story, hurriedly asking Bando for some tips, and Bando proudly recounted the process. But just as he was enthusiastically telling the story, Jinju suddenly came to find him, originally intending to talk to him politely, but Bando didn't want anything to do with her, so he used the excuse of having to attend class to refuse her. This made Jinju very angry, and she used an anonymous letter to mock him. Only then did Bando realize Jinju had also traveled back in time to this moment, so after class he pulled her her outside to talk. Bando said Jinju's acting skills were really impressive. He almost didn't recognize her, and even called her a scary woman. After that, the two started to criticize and badmouth each other. But in fact, Jinju had only come to find Bando because she wanted to know how to return to the future. But Bando didn't know either. He also thought that it would be best if they never returned to the future again. That way, they wouldn't have to fear getting divorced. Hearing this, Jinju didn't know what else to say. In the end, the two reached an agreement. From now on, they wouldn't bother each other, each living their own lives. But could their fate really end just like that? Jinju was sent back to the past during her university days, so she wanted to make up for the regrets in her heart, and the first thing she wanted to do was wear high heels to the nightclub. So Jinju and her two close friends put on high heels, preparing to go to the nightclub for some fun. But as soon as they stepped out of the dormitory, they encountered a 60-degree slope. When they saw the slope, all three of them stood frozen. But it was Jinju's first time wearing high heels, so she didn't care much and just walked straight towards the slope. As for her two close friends, they seemed to be very experienced, tiptoeing cautiously step by step for fear of losing control. At that moment, Jinju found herself in big trouble. Fortunately, not only was she okay, but she was also caught by a handsome guy. Nam-gil, seeing Jinju like that, felt very embarrassed. He even said that if she could stand steadily, then she should let go of him because he has sour body odor. Hearing this, Jinju quickly let go of his arm and explained she was really very sorry. This was her first time wearing high heels, and said that in fact he didn't smell sour at all. Hearing that, Nam-gil didn't say anything and just walked away. Coincidentally, this scene was witnessed by Bando and his two close friends. Doc J, after watching, even said next time they should come here and try the same thing. Maybe love would come to them. Jaewoo thought it was a great idea, but Bando couldn't feel any joy. After that, Jinju and her friends went to the nightclub. This was also Jinju's first time at such a place. She was like a child, curious about everything she saw, even picking up the table lamp and shaking it back and forth. But actually shaking the table lamp meant calling for service. Before long, a waiter came over and asked Jinju if she needed any help. Her friend Bo-rum quickly explained this was her first time here. When the waiter heard it was their first time, he asked Jinju if she wanted to find a guy to chat with. Jinju, hearing this, was very excited and followed the waiter into a private room. But at that moment, the future director had also set his eyes on Jinju, so the waiter brought the three girls into Hunsuk's room. But when Bo-rum saw Hunsuk's skillful flirting, she immediately sensed his intentions. But Jinju, being naive, said it was fine. After that, Bo-rum was worried. If this continued, then Jinju would likely suffer a loss. So Bo-rum told Jinju to come outside and dance disco. Just as the three of them were about to leave the private room, Hyunsuk silently handed Jinju a piece of paper with his contact information written on it. After that, Bo-rum led Jinju to the main hall, where they joined the crowd dancing to 90s disco. But as the three girls were enthusiastically dancing, they noticed that Bando's group was also there. So Jinju's two friends went to Bando's room, planning to have fun with them. However, Jinju stubbornly refused to step inside because she really didn't want to see Bando. So she sat outside drinking alone. Inside the room, Bando looked at Bo-rum, remembering her drinking ability, and didn't dare provoke her. But Doc J, sitting next to them, had no idea how strong she was, and mocked Bo-rum for having a weak drinking capacity. No matter how much Bando signaled him, Doc J paid no attention, so he and Bo-rum ended up having a drinking contest. But it didn't take long before Bo-rum drank Doc J under the table, leaving him passed out. At that moment, a waiter suddenly ran in, saying that it seemed one of their friends had drunk too much, and Jinju, now completely drunk, was on stage holding a microphone and shouting, making everyone present burst out laughing. Then Jinju, still drunk, that began to blame Bando, called him as a miser, and said that her life was ruined because of him. She asked him what about their daughter Seo-jin, what he planned to do. Hearing Seo-jin's name, Bando finally remembered, even though he had time traveled back. What about the child? Thinking of this, Bando fell into deep thought. His current life was going well, but even though he had returned to the past, his child was still in the future. Thinking about it brought tears of sorrow rolling down Bando's cheeks. To return to the future as soon as possible. Early the next morning, Bando went to find Jinju, wanting to have a proper conversation about Seo-jin. He then pulled Jinju into an empty room, where they both expressed all the frustrations in their hearts, even talking about the fact that they had a child and had divorced. But what they didn't realize was that this room was actually the school's broadcast room, and every word they said was being transmitted to every corner of the school. In an instant, all the students knew their secret, including their first loves, So-young and Nam-gil, who also heard everything. However, Bando and Jinju still hadn't realized what had happened. Additionally, Chun-sol, standing outside the door, also heard everything clearly, and soon after, the story became the hot topic of conversation among their classmates. When Bando entered the classroom, Jae-woo asked him if he had heard about the hottest news that had just spread around the school. Bando, confused, and asked what news. Jae-woo immediately said that there were students at their school school who had divorced and even had a child. Bando was extremely surprised upon hearing this, and wondered to himself what age they had got married. Jae-woo said that the age didn't matter. What mattered was that after their divorce, both of them had found new love. Bandu felt truly shocked after hearing this. This was beyond anything he could understand, but little did he know, the people Jae-woo was talking about were him and Jin-ju. It wasn't until Jae-woo mentioned that the female student had called the guy a miser and said he was useless and couldn't do anything, and that they had a huge fight, that Bando became stunned, thinking to himself that was what Jin-ju said to him. But how did Jae-woo know about this? When Bando asked his friend, Jae-woo pointed to the school's PA system. Only then did Bando realize that what the students were gossiping about was his and Jin-ju's story. Meanwhile, Jin-ju was sitting in her classroom, also hearing the students discussing her story. Even though they didn't know the female student was her, she still felt very embarrassed after hearing it. Then, during the meal, Bando deliberately sat next to Jin-ju, using eye contact to ask her what they should do. But how would Jin-ju know? And Chun-sol, sitting next to them, glared at Bando with a fierce look, because she was the only one in the entire school who knew that the main characters in the story were Bando and Jin-ju. Finally, Chun-sol couldn't hold back anymore, and called Bando a scumbag. This action left Bando confused, and Jin-ju was also very surprised, because Chun-sol had always been gentle and quiet, so why was she suddenly being so harsh? However, Chun-sol kept mumbling and calling Bando a scumbag. After she finished, she stared at Bando with a fierce gaze, making Bando too scared to look up. Eventually, over time, the story began to fade, and no one really remembered it anymore. Bando and Jin-ju were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. Right after that, Bando rushed to see his crush, and in order to win over the goddess of his dreams, he bought a lot of snacks and drinks, giving them to the goddess's group of friends. As the ancients have a saying that, if you want to conquer a girl, you must conquer her friends first. Bando handed her a cake, but So-young, fearing it would affect her weight, so she declined his kind offer. Bando, seeing that, didn't insist anymore, but just as he was about to leave, So-young suddenly fainted. When Bando saw her faint on the ground, he immediately rushed over to carry her to the infirmary. It turned out that So-young had not eaten anything for a long time to control her weight. After So-young woke up in the infirmary, her stomach started growling from hunger. Seeing that So-young had regained consciousness, Bando took her to a barbecue restaurant, but So-young was still determined to lose weight and refused to eat any food. Having no other option, Bando sat and ate the meat deliciously in front of her, using words to disturb her mind, occasionally teasing her, asking if she wanted to try just one piece, just one. Finally, So-young couldn't resist anymore, saying that she could eat one piece, and then she picked up a piece of meat and put it in her mouth. As So-young ate the meat, she felt very satisfied, and Bando, seeing that So-young had started eating, was much less worried. But after they had eaten their fill, So-young began to worry again, complaining that she had probably gained a few more pounds. Hearing this, Bando took out a pair of sneakers and said, "Now that we're full, let's go exercise together. This way we can burn off some of the calories we just consumed." Then So-young walked with Bando on the street, but So-young was very curious and asked Bando that where the sneakers came from, and how did you know her shoe size? He said that he had bought the shoes, of course, and as for the size, he could tell just by looking. So-young laughed and said, "It's not possible to know the size just by looking." Bando quickly replied, "If you have the heart, there's nothing you can't know." Hearing this made So-young very happy. Then they both went up the mountain to view the entire city. So-young felt that this moment was wonderfully beautiful, and Bando leaned on the railing quietly watching her. At that moment, he felt extremely happy and wished time could stand still. Afterward, Bando took So-young to the bus stop. So-young thanked Bando, saying she had a great time today, and he was the first person to make her feel this way for a long time. Hearing this made Bando so happy that his heart raced, feeling that everything he did was worth it. But after Bando saw So-young off and looked up, the smile on his face immediately disappeared, because he saw his future in-laws across the street. Seeing the future in-laws' father and mother made Bando very uncomfortable. Just as his future in-laws walked past him, he hurriedly turned around and stared blankly, because he hadn't seen both of them for a long time. The next day, Bando quietly went to the front of his future in-laws' house and observed secretly. But at that moment, a stranger accidentally bumped into the mother, and moreover, did not let go, causing her to panic and not know what to do. At this moment, Bando suddenly appeared, pushed the stranger aside, and then scolded him. The stranger then loudly asked him who he was to meddle in other people's affairs, so Bando replied that he was her son. Was there any problem? Hearing this, the stranger had no intention of continuing to argue, and the mother, upon seeing Bando, was also very surprised because she did not know him at all. When Bando turned to look at his mother-in-law, he suddenly recalled the scene of her passing away. Back in college, there was a legend that at night strange sounds would come from the library, and the senior students regarded it as a haunted place. That day, Jinju's classmates, to uncover the secret of the library, set up a challenge. The brave students went inside to retrieve retrieve a book, but after going in, several friends were so scared that they eventually ran out. Jinju was a person who completely did not believe in evil spirits, so she initiatively went inside, but right at that moment, a book suddenly fell from the shelf. Seeing this scene, Jinju suddenly remembered that she had been here before. At that time when she was threatened, she accidentally discovered that the so-called ghost inside was all a trick by her senior to scare them. Thinking of this, Jinju began to turn the tables. Meanwhile, the senior was crouching on the chair looking for an opportunity to scare Jinju. Unexpectedly, in the end, he was scared by her instead. The two seniors were so frightened by Jinju that they screamed and ran outside. Perhaps for the rest of their lives, they would never dare return to this library again. After Jinju dealt with the seniors who scared others, she began searching for the red envelope symbolizing victory. But as soon as she grabbed the red letter, she stumbled and fell down the stairs. Fortunately, at that moment, her savior appeared. Looking at the young man in front of her, Jinju was extremely surprised. She quickly stood up and took a few steps back, but unfortunately she bumped into the ladder, causing it to collapse. Because of her, Namgil got injured. This made her feel very guilty. Seeing him massaging his ankle, she hurriedly came over to check and discovered his ankle was swollen, but being a man, Namgil tried to endure the pain and said he was fine. However, Jinju didn't care about what he said. She was determined to help Namgil up and take him outside. Later, because Jinju bravely rushed into the library, the classmates held a special celebration party for her. The students all expressed their admiration for Jinju, while Jinju said that there was nothing scary about ghosts. The scariest thing was humans. After saying that, Jinju glanced toward Namgil. Remembering that his ankle was still swollen, she hurriedly brought over an ice pack and telling him to use it. However, Namgil did not care about it at all. Out of options, Jinju had no choice but to forcefully lift Namgil's leg onto the chair and apply the ice pack for him. After finishing the task, she continued to enthusiastically toast with other classmates, and Namgil, when seeing Jinju's aspect, gradually developed feelings of affection. He thought to himself why this girl was so special. Soon after, Jinju drank to the point of being extremely drunk. Namgil watched her drowsy state and found her very endearing. After the party ended, he followed her to see what she would be like when drunk. Jinju, while sitting on the bus, breathed on the window and drew a small footprint on it. She missed her child very much, and thinking about her over 2-year-old child made Jinju very worried. She then sadly burst into tears, and Namgil saw this entire scene. Finally, only when Jinju arrived home did he feel reassured and leave, while Bando was still sitting alone to drinking and crying, because he and his ex-wife traveled back in time 20 years, but their child is still in the future. Every time they think about their child, both Bando and Jinju feel very heartbroken. This is also the reason why Jinju sits curled up on the bed, crying miserably. The next morning, Jinju woke up with a start, but when she realized she hadn't traveled back in time, then she cried again. Hearing her cries, her mother hurried into the room. Seeing her daughter crying so pitifully made her very worried because Jinju had been acting so strangely lately. When Jinju saw her mother, she felt even more guilty. She leaned forward to hug her mother because she had once experienced the feeling of losing her mother, and now, being able to see her again seemed to be a gift from heaven to prevent her mother from leaving her again. Jinju decided to take her mother to the hospital for an examination, but the doctor told Jinju that her mother might need long-term treatment in the future. Jinju asked the doctor if there was a chance of complications occurring 10 years later if she underwent dialysis, and the doctor replied that of course, there was a possibility, and complications could even occur as soon as tomorrow. Jinju asked if there was any way to minimize the complications, and the doctor said that the best way was to continue treatment, so her mother could live to be 100 years old. Hearing the doctor's words, Jinju realized that there was no way to save her mother anymore. When Jinju went to the patient's room and looked at her mother lying in bed, she felt very guilty and did not know how to save her. Later, Jinju carried a sad mood sitting in the school cafeteria, and this scene happened to be seen by Namgil, so he brought rice cum and sat next to her, and said that eating alone was really boring. However, Jinju was not eating alone. Namgil, seeing this, then quickly cured the shames by himself by saying that he was the one eating alone. After that, Namgil and Jinju's group of 3 ate together. The 2 close friends of Jinju were very excited to see Namgil because they rarely had the chance to eat with his handsome senior. After Namgil and Jinju finished eating, he told her to come with him. Jinju, not understanding what was happening, just followed him. She asked him why he suddenly paid attention to her, and Namgil replied that it was because she was flirting with him. Jinju didn't believe that she was flirting with him. She had never flirted with anyone in her life, and what happened at the library earlier was just an accident. Then Jinju asked if his leg was feeling better and reminded him to apply ice regularly, or it would lead to complications later. Seeing Jinju's aspect, Namgil laughed and said that she was indeed flirting with him. Jinju hurriedly denied it, but Namgil still thought she was flirting with him. Moreover, his leg still hurt. Each step was painful. Hearing this, this, Jinju went over to check. This action startled Namgil, and causing him to quickly step back a few paces and then limp away. He went to the school bathroom to prepare for a shower, but just as he was about to undress, he suddenly heard people talking about Jinju right next to him. It turned out that Hunsuk was recounting how, 2 days ago, he had met a girl named Jinju who seemed very innocent. It was the right time to have some fun. Hearing this, Namgil felt very angry. At the same time, Bondo was sitting directly across from them and heard everything. He could not stay calm upon hearing others badmouthing his ex-wife, so he kicked the guy into the swimming pool. After that, Bondo, fuming with rage, turned and left. He exited the bathroom and went to find his first love, So Young, because they had planned to go see a movie together that night. However, when he got on the bus, because the driver's driving skills was very poor, this led to So Young frequently falling into Bondo's arms, which made her very embarrassed. Bondo, seeing that, then proactively said that if getting hurt from falling, the person suffer the loss would be her. So Young held on to Bondo's arm, feeling embarrassed but also safe. They then went to the movie theater, but just as Bondo was about to buy tickets and turned around, he unexpectedly ran into his future father-in-law. That scared him and made he to fled into the bathroom. But after regaining his composure, he remembered that his future father-in-law did not know him at that moment, so there was no reason to be afraid. Therefore, Bondo cautiously sneaked out of the bathroom, but he could not have anticipated that Jinju and Namgil were also there to watch a movie. And Jinju turned to Namgil and asked, "Wasn't it supposed to go to the hospital? How did it turn into a movie theater like that?" Namgil said that watching movies is good for health, and by that way his leg would heal faster. But this silly reason was hard for Jinju to believe. However, at that moment, Jinju also spotted Bondo, and the two began to signal each other subtly. Jinju even deliberately brought up the previous time when Namgil confessed his feelings and suggested that they should date. Hearing Jinju's words, Bondo was furious, because he always thought he was Jinju's first love. Cannot believe that someone named Namgil had appeared midway and gotten in the way. Seeing Jinju deliberately trying to provoke him, Bondo began to retaliate, which made Jinju extremely angry. Later, the two couples went to the same movie theater. Everyone there was crying their eyes out while watching the film, but only Bondo and Jinju found it very ordinary. Moreover, Bondo wasn't even interested in the movie and spent the entire time staring at Jinju. After the movie ended, they went outside together, and at that moment, Jinju's father suddenly approached. Bondo instinctively greeted him, but Jinju's father did not understand who he was, asked him who he was. Realizing his mistake, Bondo quickly said he was just a passerby, and then hurriedly ran away out of embarrassment. Meanwhile, Jinju's father was staring intently at his daughter and the young man who went to the movie with her. Jinju quickly explained that Namgil was her senior, but her father suddenly took notice of the jacket Namgil was holding in her hand. Seeing this, Namgil explained that because he had injured his leg, he had temporarily troubled Jinju. Jinju told her father not to overthink it, as Namgil was just her senior. Her father then asked Jinju to come home with him, but Jinju told her father that she could go home on her own. Her father, hearing this, then didn't press her further and turned to leave. After seeing Jinju's father, Namgil felt much more at ease. Later, Namgil and Jinju went to a restaurant. When they sat at the table, Jinju said she felt like he might be lying about his leg hurting. Namgil replied that it seemed she was very concerned about whether his leg was actually hurt. Jinju said that was only natural because it was because of her that he was in that condition. Hearing this, Namgil was stunned and thought to himself about how adorable this girl was. Jinju, in facing Namgil's gaze, felt shy and embarrassed and couldn't bring herself to look directly at him. To alleviate her embarrassment, Jinju offered to pay for the meal and asked Namgil what he wanted to eat. Unexpectedly, Namgil bluntly said he wanted to eat her. Jinju was taken aback by this response. Afterward, Namgil took Jinju to her doorstep and wished her a pleasant evening. After saying this, Namgil turned to leave, but just a few steps away, a stranger grabbed his arm. When Namgil realized that the person grabbing him was Jinju's father, he felt very tense. Jinju's father asked what they did after watching the movie. Namgil politely answered that they only went for a drink. Jinju's father kept questioning Namgil's drinking capacity and family background. When he found out that Namgil's father was the director of the school, Jinju's father became extremely excited, and his attitude towards Namgil immediately changed. He even asked Namgil if he truly liked his daughter Jinju. Namgil did not hide it and openly admitted it. The next morning, Jinju took a bus to the school bus stop, where she coincidentally ran into So Young. She also saw So Young putting her umbrella into her bag. Seeing this, Jinju thought to herself, this girl really knows how to plan ahead. Then Bondo also took the bus and arrived there. Seeing this, Jinju thought, could it be that this is the way to get what you want, like a crying baby gets milk? After thinking that, she turned to walk away, but after only a few steps, her umbrella suddenly broke, standing in the pouring rain. Jinju had no idea what to do. At that moment, Namgil suddenly appeared and covered her with his umbrella. His appearance felt like a savior in her life. After that, Jinju and Namgil walked together into the school, and during During this time, Namgil intentionally tilted the umbrella towards Jinju, letting one side of his shoulder get soaked. Jinju then noticed his shoulder was drenched with rainwater, so she quickly moved closer to him. Meanwhile, Bando and Seo Young were also walking down the street while sharing an umbrella. Moreover, the two couples were walking in opposite directions. As they passed each other, both glanced toward the other, and in that moment, they suddenly felt an odd sense of jealousy. Not long after, when they arrived at the classroom, Bando noticed Namgil's soaked shoulder and felt disdain in his heart. He even took out a pen to measure and muttered to himself, thinking that Namgil's shoulders weren't that much broader than his own. Meanwhile, Jinju, that's sitting right behind, also noticed Bando's wet shoulder. She suddenly remembered that every time she stood in the heavy rain, Bando would always bring two umbrellas and hand her one, never once offering to share his umbrella with her. Thinking about this, Jinju pouted and muttered to herself, cursing Bando as useless. Soon after the school's annual festival took place, the event had everything, resembling a local fair, where students could participate in extracurricular activities to enrich their campus life. Jinju joined her close friend to experience these exciting activities, but while they were walking around, they noticed two female students struggling to carry a crate of drinks. Seeing this, Jinju quickly ran over to help. If she saw any students who didn't know how to cook, she would also offer her help. This scene was coincidentally witnessed by Namgil, and it made him see her in a different light. Later on, Jinju even showcased her excellent cooking skills. When everyone saw Jinju's skilled cooking techniques, all the students were amazed. Soon after, a fragrant plate of stir-fried pork with chili was ready. Jinju picked up a piece and gave it to her classmates to try. Everyone was surprised by how delicious the dish was. Namgil, that standing nearby seeing this, assumed it would soon be his turn, but just as he opened his mouth, one of the juniors took a bite before him. They even said that since Jinju made such a tasty dish, they wanted to make it the main course. Hearing this, Jinju responded, "It's just the first dish that made all excited. If she made other dishes, all people here would probably be even more shocked." As she said that, Jinju was about to give a bite to Namgil, but was interrupted by her classmate, which made Namgil extremely annoyed. At that moment, Bando also arrived at the festival with So-young to enjoy the activities. Bando, like an excited child, that led So-young around to try out all the games. Coincidentally, Jinju saw this scene. After wandering around, Bandu eventually made his way to the section of his department. The upperclassmen, seeing that all the students were busy helping with activities, saw Bando on a date instead. That made them very angry and scolded him. Jinju also came over to check out what was happening, and also said that she wanted to join in their game, but Jinju wanted Bando to be the target. Jinju kept throwing water balloons at her ex-husband, and the reason Jinju was so accurate was because she had honed this skill while taking care of their child. So now when she threw the balloons at Bando, she didn't miss a single shot. But So-young, that standing nearby, couldn't just stand there and watch anymore. She asked Jae if they could change the target. Jae then turned to plead with the upperclassmen, but Jinju said she didn't want to change the target. She only wanted to throw at this one person. Late at night, when the two of them were sitting at the same table, Bando deliberately teased Jinju. Coincidentally, So-young was also looking for Bando. When Bando saw So-young, then called her over. Seeing So-young arrive, Jinju tactfully stood up and left. At the same time, Namgil also came over, so Bando and So-young sat next to each other, chatting happily, while Namgil sat nearby watching Jinju cook. During that time, Jinju kept glancing at So-young and Bando. Her mind couldn't help but recall the rainy morning, and Bando looked at Jinju and Namgil, also thinking about the scene from that morning. Then when Jinju finished cooking, Namgil went over and took her hand, getting ready for Jinju to feed him. But at that moment, when she looked over at Bando, he suddenly remembered the scene that happened earlier at the swimming pool. He also realized that the relationship between Jinju and Bando might not be simple at all. However, Jinju and Bando refused to back down, relentlessly provoking and teasing each other. Just as Bando was mocking Jinju, a classmate from the student council suddenly came looking for her. It turned out that the school was organizing a beauty contest, but their department didn't have anyone participating, so they immediately thought of Jinju. However, Jinju said she couldn't participate because her appearance wasn't anything special, and besides, her clothes were already dirty. At that moment, Namgil suddenly appeared with a new set of clothes and said, "These are available clothes I had in my car." Jinju wondered why he had women's clothes in his car. Namgil replied that they belonged to his sister. Just as Jinju was hesitating, unsure whether to participate or not, Bandu said, "You won't win the queen title. You'll be lucky if you're not dead last." Jinju challenged, "What if I win first place?" Bando confidently replied, "Then I'll become your pet." Upon hearing this, Jinju decided to enter the contest. When she changed into a beautiful dress with her hair falling to her shoulders, she instantly transformed into a glowing goddess. When her ex-husband saw her in this appearance, he couldn't even believe his own eyes. He even turned to ask his best friend, "Is it possible that girls can become this beautiful just by putting on some makeup?" His friend didn't know how to respond. At that moment, Jinju was standing on the stage, feeling equally nervous, so much so that even introducing herself was quite awkward. But even in that state, it was enough to make Namgil unable to take his eyes off her. Then the host asked Jinju if she had any special talents. She said that she was very good at eating and didn't have any other particular skills. Seeing the audience's reaction, Jinju planned to withdraw, but the host wouldn't let her leave, forced to perform. Jinju thought for a moment and finally decided to sing a song. However, the more Jinju sang, the more enthusiastic she became, and she couldn't stop. Meanwhile, Bando, when seeing how remarkable Jinju was, that started to doubt his eyes and ears, because in his eyes, she was just a grand aunt who spent her days taking care of her children and family. With her sweet voice, Jinju successfully became the new beauty queen of the school. After her performance, Jinju was about to head to the restroom to change her clothes. However, she saw that the women's restroom had a closed for maintenance sign hanging, leaving her unsure of what to do. She then noticed that the men's restroom was empty, so she decided to go there to change her clothes. Just as Jinju was changing, Hyunsuk and a few of his friends came in and casually started talking about her right in the restroom. He said that once he was done having fun with her, he would let his friends have their turn. Hearing these words, Jinju was furious and immediately pushed the door open, ready to teach them a lesson. But to her surprise, the person standing outside the door was Namgil. Just as Namgil was about to speak, someone suddenly approached, and in a panic, he quickly pulled Jinju back inside the room. However, the world truly seems to work through coincidences. As Bandu slowly opened the door to the restroom, Jinju had no idea how to explain the situation, while Bando and Namgil stared at each other like rivals. As they were about to leave, Namgil intentionally called Bando back, using a mocking tone to taunt him. Bando, that was not one to back down, immediately retaliated. Witnessing this, Jinju quickly tried to mediate, telling Namgil to hurry up and return the clothes to his sister before she noticed. Hearing this, Bandu said, "In this world, what kind of brother would keep his sister's clothes in his car? It's obvious they were bought for some girl." Namgil admitted that he bought them for Jinju. After saying that, Namgil gently brushed Jinju's hair and told her to just wear the clothes, then turned and left. Bando was unable to tolerate it anymore, then asked Jinju in a jealous tone if she wanted to live a happy life with that rich, handsome guy. Hearing him say this, Jinju became very angry, not expecting Bando to still be so childish. She glared at him fiercely before quickly walking away. Suddenly, Jinju received a message, and the sender was none other than the scumbag Hyunsuk. She remembered what Bando had once told her, that Hyunsuk was extremely hypocritical. She also recalled the things she'd overheard in the restroom. It was now beyond doubt that Hyunsuk was truly a scumbag. To get rid of this menace, Jinju quickly contacted Bando to figure out how to deal with him together. However, Bandu initially refused to help, as he didn't want to get himself into more trouble. Besides, he had already gotten his revenge on Hyunsuk. He even advised Jinju to focus on herself first, but Jinju became furious after hearing this, because Hyunsuk didn't just play with women's emotions. The most important thing was that he had used her as a backup option. Jinju swore to make him pay, and it wasn't easy to see Jinju initiatively begging him once. In the end, Bando decided to help her avenge this grudge. The first step they took was for Jinju to reply to Hyunsuk's message, agreeing to meet him tonight. After that, Bando informed Hyunsuk that Jinju was the daughter of the Sangsong group, leading Hyunsuk to believe that he should pretend to pursue her. That evening when the two met, Jinju pretended to be actively engaged in conversation, making Hyunsuk think he had the upper hand. He invited her to the group's dinner party. Bando then arranged to meet Hyunsuk's poor girlfriend. Initially, she did not believe him, but when Bando said that Hyunsuk had sent him, she finally believed it. Later, Hyunsuk and Jinju went to the group's dinner party together. However, Hyunsuk found an excuse to take Jinju to a secluded place and directly asked her why she wanted to approach him. Jinju continued to act as if she didn't know anything, but Hyunsuk had already investigated and found that the Sangsong group had no daughter. Jinju was extremely panicked upon hearing this, and she said that there must be some mistake and that she was not any kind of heiress. After saying this, Jinju hurriedly ran outside. However, Hyunsuk immediately pulled her back and threatened that if Jinju did not tell the truth, he would resort to hitting women. Just as Hyunsuk was about to raise his hand, he was stopped by three girls standing outside. These three girls were also Hyunsuk's girlfriends. Seeing that he was playing around with three women, they had no intention of letting him off easily. Hyunsuk tried to run away, but how could he escape from three women who, though seemingly innocent, were determined to catch him cheating? In front of them, he put on a naive and pleasant smile, but behind the backs he was involved with the three of them. Hearing this, Hyunsuk hurriedly explained that it was just a misunderstanding, but at that moment when he turned around and saw his real heiress girlfriend standing right there, he rushed over to explain. No matter how much Hyunsuk tried to explain, the heiress girlfriend refused to believe him. He then saw Bando standing next to him and realized that it was all a trap set up by Bando and Jinju. After that, Bandu even lied that, "I am the new boyfriend of the heiress," which made Hyunsuk, in his anger, reveal his true feelings. However, he soon realized that he was only harming himself. In the end, Hyun-suk couldn't hold back anymore and rushed to beat Bando. Seeing this, Jinju couldn't stand by any longer and immediately ran over to kick him, causing him a great deal of pain. After resolving the situation, Bando and Jinju went home together. However, on the way back, Bando suddenly noticed that Jinju's arm was injured, so he quickly asked her what had happened. Jinju looked at her arm and remembered that the injury was caused by Hyun-suk. Seeing this, Bando hurriedly went to buy bandages and gently applied them to her arm. Seeing Bando's serious demeanor, Jinju felt very complicated emotions. She really wished that time could stand still at that moment. She remembered that their family of 3 had once been very happy, spending every day together, which was truly the happiest time of her life. Meanwhile, Bando was also reminiscing about those happy scenes, but neither of them understood why things had turned out this way. At this moment, both of them shed tears, and Jinju, that carried much emotion with emotions, went home alone. But then she suddenly realized she was being followed. Since Jinju had previously exposed Suk's deceitful nature, he had sworn to take revenge on her. Jinju was terrified and quickly called Bando. However, Bando was also on a call and could not answer Jinju's phone. Hyun-suk forcibly took Jinju to a secluded place. He was almost mad, claiming that Jinju had ruined everything for him and questioning if she knew how much effort he had put into dating the wealthy heiress. But Jinju remained firm and considered him a complete failure. Hyun-suk couldn't hold back any longer and raised his hand to hit Jinju. However, at that moment, Namgil appeared just in time. He immediately kicked Hyun-suk, sending him tumbling down the slope. Yet Hyun-suk was still not convinced and stood up to charge at Namgil. Facing Namgil's imposing figure, it was clear that Hyun-suk was no match for him. Namgil was about to teach him a lesson, but fortunately, Jinju quickly pulled him back and scolded Hyun-suk. After that, she and Namgil left the place. For Jinju's safety, Namgil decided to personally take her home. However, on the way back, Jinju suddenly realized an issue and turned to ask Namgil, "Why did you suddenly come to this area?" Namgil replied that he felt the air was fresh and decided to take a walk. Hearing this, Jinju asked if he had developed feelings for her. Namgil responded that he had already answered that question before. Jinju advised him not to like her. Although she looked like she was in her 20s, she felt like an old aunt inside. Namgil didn't understand, and Jinju, realizing she had a slip of the tongue, then quickly ran into the house. The next morning, her mother appeared in her room because she had noticed something unusual about Jinju's recent state. Additionally, she had discovered that Jinju often talked in her sleep and called out the name Seo Jin. So she came to ask Jinju who Seo Jin was and if he was the boy who was at the door that day. Upon hearing the name Seo Jin, Jinju couldn't help but let tears fall. To avoid worrying her mother, Jinju quickly wiped away her tears and suggested they go to the public bathhouse. Shortly afterward, Jinju and her mother finished bathing, and her mother even thoughtfully dried her hair. Passers-by admired the mother-daughter relationship upon seeing this scene. Later, Jinju and her mother sat in front of the grocery store, enjoying yogurt together. This was the scene Jinju had longed for. However, just as they were happily sitting together, a mother pushing a baby stroller suddenly came by. The mother, when seeing the baby, was very hysteric, while Jinju felt both touched and sad. She then asked her mother if she would be very happy if she could see her son. Her mother, hearing this, thought Jinju might have a mental issue, remarking that she was still so young and thinking about children already. Nevertheless, her mother believed that Jinju's future child would certainly be chubby, white, and cute, just like Jinju was when she was little. Hearing these words, Jinju remembered her own child, but the only regret was that her mother had passed away by the time the baby was born. Thinking of this, Jinju hugged her mother and cried. Her mother, unsure of what was wrong with her daughter, could only hold her and comfort her. Jinju apologized to her mother for causing her so much trouble. Although her mother didn't understand what her daughter was saying, she still gently told her not to cry anymore. That day, Bando happened to see Jinju walking on the street, so he decided to take her home. On the way back, they talked about Hyun-suk. When it came up, Jinju scolded Bando, asking if he knew how to use a phone because he hadn't answered when it was important. It turned out that when Jinju discovered she was being followed by Hyun-suk, the first person she tried to call was Bando. However, Bando did not pick up. Jinju, deeply disappointed, and said that perhaps she had placed too much expectation on him. Whenever she needed him the most, he was never there. After speaking, Jinju disappointed and turned and went into the house. However, upon hearing this, Bando felt very guilty. When Jinju's mother passed away, he had been unable to return to Jinju due to an incident, which prevented her from seeing her mother for the last time. When being lost in thought, Bando looked up and found his mother-in-law right in front of him. Her had also recognized him as the person who had helped her before. Bando held great respect for his mother-in-law and moved to help her with her belongings. However, at that moment, his mother-in-law asked if he was Seo Jin, which greatly surprised Bando. She thanked him for his help the previous day, but mentioned that she didn't like anyone who made her daughter cry. At first, she thought Jinju was crying every night because of some outstanding young man. Hearing this made Bando feel uncomfortable. uncomfortable. Just as his mother-in-law was about to leave, Bando decided to introduce himself as Choi Bando. Upon hearing that he was not Sojin, his mother-in-law hurriedly apologized and quickly handed him 2 peaches, saying that Jinju really liked them, so she had bought a bit more. However, after returning home and seeing the 2 peaches on the table, Bando felt guilty. When Jinju's sister had sent fruit to them, Jinju had hesitated and asked to leave out the peaches because Bando was allergic to them. Because of this issue, that since their marriage, Jinju had not eaten a single peach. Reflecting on this, Bando felt very sad and chose to drink alcohol to drown his sorrows. The next morning, when Bando woke up and looked around the room, he thought he had time traveled back in time, and he even heard Jinju calling his name. Without saying a word, Bando immediately ran over and hugged Jinju, crying with joy because he believed they had returned to the future. But when he turned around, Jinju had disappeared. When he opened his eyes, Bando realized that the scene from earlier was just a dream. After the couple time traveled back to their university days, Bando realized how beautiful his wife had been and how exceptional she was. Looking at Jinju's figure, Bando thought about the past and felt that he truly owed her so much. So he decided to take Jinju to experience their youth properly by going on a spontaneous trip. Bando borrowed his father's car and went around kidnapping each of their friends. Just like that, the 6 of them embarked on an unexpected adventure together. This was perhaps what youth should look like: taking the person you love, gathering your best friends, and going to see the beauty of the world together. However, something unfortunate happened. Bando drove based on his memory, but many of the roads from 20 years ago hadn't been completed. At this point, Bando felt quite helpless, so he mustered up the courage to drive them to a deserted place where not a soul was in sight. After getting out of the car, they looked around. They had no idea what fun they could have there. Luckily, Bando's group had already prepared a lot of food. They ended up grilling meat and drinking beer together. Perhaps the joy of youth isn't about where you go, but about being with friends and loved ones. That's what true happiness is. The 6 friends sat around the fire, happily playing together, but Bando kept reminiscing about his past self. Seeing Bando like this, Jinju understood his feelings, and she too began to remember the times they had spent together, thinking about how happy they had been when they got married. Both of them shed tears at the same time. The next day, the group woke up like wanderers, being called out by workers. It turned out that the place they had come to was actually a construction site. Not long after, Jinju and her 2 best friends were also woken up by the workers, but their faces were covered with black streaks, looking extremely funny. After that, they continued their journey. While driving, Bando looked at Jinju in this state and laughed heartily, while Jinju, on the other hand, was already thinking about how to murder someone and hide the body without being caught. Soon, the group arrived at the beach. Seeing the vast, endless ocean before them, they were all very excited. They quickly jumped out of the car and ran to the shore, playing in the water together. Bando watched the smile on Jinju's face and felt truly happy inside. Later, when they were about to head to the hotel to rent rooms, they suddenly saw Namgil arriving as well, leaving Bando wide-eyed in surprise. It turned out that their friends were trying to set up Jinju with Namgil, so they had intentionally called him there to set him up with Jinju. Seeing Namgil appear in that place made Bando feel very uncomfortable. He glared at Namgil with a fierce look and even mocked him for wearing a suit while on a trip, sarcastically asking if there was something wrong with his brain. During the meal, Bando served everyone oysters, but when it came to Namgil's turn, he only gave him a single clam and asked why he wore such uncomfortable clothes there, making everyone feel uneasy looking at him. Namgil calmly responded that he didn't feel uncomfortable at all and that he had come to enjoy the fresh air. Bando angrily retorted, "You came this far just to get some fresh air?" Namgil, seeing this, then didn't bother to respond further. However, Bando wasn't ready to let it go and kept targeting Namgil. Meanwhile, Jinju accidentally spilled water on herself while drinking. Seeing this, Bando immediately helped her wipe it off, but the sight made Namgil feel awkward since it was actually beer that had spilled on her. Jinju decided she had to change clothes, but fortunately, Bo-Rome and her boyfriend had bought a couple's set of clothes and had 2 extra shirts. Seeing this, Namgil asked Jinju if he could borrow one, saying that wearing a uniform was indeed a bit uncomfortable. But just as Namgil grabbed the shirt, Bando quickly snatched it out of his hands. Both of them refused to let go, leading to a heated argument. Jinju, sitting beside them, felt helpless and had to think of another way to handle the situation. In the end, the 2 men ended up wearing the couple's shirts, and they actually looked quite good together. However, what no one could have expected was that they were actually rivals in love. Passersby, who saw their matching outfits, smiled in amusement. Finally, because they disliked each other so much, they decided to walk in opposite directions. Later, they all returned to the hotel, and both Namgil and Bando quickly changed into different clothes. Feeling bored, the Jinju decided to take a walk alone along a small mountain path, but she hadn't gone far when she ran into Namgil, and the 2 of them ended up strolling and chatting together. Meanwhile, after Bando finished packing, he also went out to look for Jinju. By that time, Jinju and Namgil had wandered to a very special place. Both were amazed by the sight before them. Fireflies everywhere, with the moon hanging high in the sky, casting a beautiful glow. Jinju was so astonished by the scene that she stood there, frozen in awe. Namgil, seeing her like that, quickly took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, then naturally pulled her into an embrace. It seemed that taking off his jacket hadn't been a waste after all, as it gave him the chance to be closer to her. But this scene was coincidentally witnessed by Bando. Seeing his ex-wife being embraced by another man made him feel deeply uncomfortable. Bando just stood there on the opposite side, helplessly watching the scene unfold. The next day, their trip came to an end. One of their friends, in an attempt to force Jinju to sit in Namgil's car, deliberately took all the luggage from the trunk and placed it on the seats. Just as Jinju was about to get in the car, her friend said there wasn't enough room and suggested she ride with Namgil instead. However, Bando objected, insisting there was still space in the car. At that moment, Jinju looked at Namgil and felt it wasn't right for him to drive back alone, so in the end she chose to ride with Namgil. When they arrived back at school, Jinju coincidentally got her period and quickly ran into the bathroom. But a problem arose. She had forgotten to pack sanitary pads in her bag, so she called her friends, but since both of their phones were left in the classroom, so no one answered. After thinking for a while, Jinju decided to call Bando. At that time, Bando had already gone to the pharmacy to buy her some painkillers. When he received Jinju's call, she casually asked him to buy some sanitary pads for her, and Bando just as casually agreed. Afterward, Bando went to the entrance of the women's restroom. However, he was confused about how he should hand them over. Just as Bando was trying to figure out a way, two of his friends suddenly appeared behind him, startling him. One of the friends kicked him playfully, causing the contents of Bando's bag to spill out. Seeing what had fallen, the friends started to question Bando's masculinity, wondering why he would bring such items to school. But Bando didn't seem to care much. Seeing that Jinju's friends had also arrived, he asked them to take the items to her. After handing over the pads, Bando quickly left. When Jinju came out of the bathroom, she was in so much pain that she slumped over the desk. Even when her friends invited her to lunch, she refused. Just as Jinju was about to take her painkillers, Bando appeared with a cup of hot water. He reminded her that, as he had many times before, that she should always take her medicine with water, not soda. But instead of being grateful, Jinju snapped at Bando for meddling. Bando didn't take it to heart though. Instead, he placed his bag on the desk for her to use as a pillow and gently patted her back. It turned out that Jinju always had back pain during her period, and in the past, Bando would always stay by her side, softly patting her back in defiance of day or night. Seeing this, Jinju was reminded of the happy times they had shared together. Just then, Bando noticed the mark on her finger where her ring used to be. Then, he glanced at the mark where his ring had been, and it made him realize that their time travel to the past might be related to those rings. If they could find those rings, there was a good chance they could return to the future. While Bando was walking through the campus, a luxurious car suddenly approached him. Inside was a wealthy heiress, and the reason the car had stopped was because she had taken an interest in Bando. But in order to avoid her, Bando quickly sped up his pace. At that moment, the girl suddenly spoke up, asking if the girl Jinju, who had been with him the other day, was alright. She mentioned that she had heard Hunsuk had gone looking for her, and might have even tried to start a fight. Hearing this, Bando's mood darkened instantly. Enragedly, he stormed into the medical department, not saying a word before charging at Hunsuk and landing a punch. After that, he delivered blow after blow. Remembering how he had endured Hunsuk's bullying in the past, Bando had swallowed his pride and even apologized to him. But now, Hunsuk had hurt the person he loved most, and Bando couldn't let it go, even if it killed him. This was perhaps the love Bando had for Jinju. Sometimes a husband's love for his wife isn't shown through small gestures. Instead, that it's at critical moments that he would stand in front of his wife and shield her from everything. That night, Bando called Jinju, telling her that he was outside the door, holding a box of grapes and waiting for her. He wondered to himself why he was like this, why he couldn't seem to do anything right. He had always lived honestly and tried his best, but whether it was today or 10 years ago, everything still felt like a mess. At that moment, Bando was full of self-blame because of his immaturity back then, which had caused Jinju to miss the chance to see her mother for the last time. He had always felt guilty about it. That's why every day, when they faced each other, he forced himself to smile, no matter what frustrations he had to endure outside. But the moment he stepped into the house, a smile would always appear on his face. However, this very behavior made Jinju feel that, in Bando's heart, the death of her mother didn't matter. This misunderstanding caused their resentment toward each other to grow stronger and stronger until that day when neither of them could hold on anymore. Eventually, they chose to divorce, but now Bando genuinely wanted to make up for those regrets. Seeing Bando's vulnerable appearance, Jinju didn't know what to say. At that moment, her mother suddenly opened the door and came out. Seeing Bando and Jinju's expressions, she was confused and even thought that there was some unspeakable relationship between them, and Jinju to reassure her mother, so she told her mother that a classmate had had encountered some unfortunate events, and then asked her to go inside the house first. However, her mother suddenly turned around and asked Bando if he had eaten yet. She then invited him inside for a meal. During the meal, she specially picked up some fish and placed it on his spoon. This reminded Bando of how, every time he came over for dinner in the past, his mother-in-law would always give him some fish to eat. Looking at the mother-in-law sitting in front of him, countless thoughts swirled in Bando's mind. After the meal, Jinju's mother personally escorted Bando to the door. Jinju asked her mother to go back inside, while she and Bando sat outside to talk. Bando still felt deeply guilty and told Jinju that she was right. Every time she needed him, he wasn't there for her. He thought he could always protect her, but now he understood why she said she wasn't happy. But Jinju didn't need him to protect or provide for her. She only needed Bando to be by her side. She wanted them both to support their family together, to cry together, and to share her burdens. Jinju said that even though a long time had passed, Bando needed to understand that marriage was about both of them, and that at times they both resented each other. However, those resentments had never been fully resolved. They were simply left to accumulate over time, ultimately leading to their current situation. Sometimes Jinju just wanted him to hold her and cry together. Hearing these words, Bando felt deeply troubled. He thought that was all he could do for her at the time. Bando didn't want to make Jinju cry. He just wanted her to be happy and smile forever. The two of them looked at each other, and their eyes brimming with tears. To find a way back to the future as soon as possible, the next day, they went to the school library to look for records related to time travel. But after searching for a long time, they couldn't find any useful information. Just then, Bandu noticed the ring mark on Jinju's hand, so he asked her when it had appeared. Jinju responded that it had been there ever since she had traveled back in time. Upon hearing this, Bando immediately realized that the pair of rings was the key to their time travel. He then began frantically searching for the rings. After visiting countless jewelry stores, he finally spotted them in a shop. Without hesitation, he bought the rings. But when Bando went to find Jinju, he happened to see her hugging her mother. At that moment, he hesitated, unsure whether to take her back to the future or not. Remembering the scene from when they had dinner at her house, he could see that she truly cherished the time spent with her mother. Observing the backs of the two women, Bando decided to wait a little longer. Meanwhile, while Jinju and her mother were out walking, they unexpectedly encountered a drunk man, causing a commotion on the street. Seeing this man, Jinju immediately recalled what Bando had once told her about the hardships he endured outside. He had to endure being treated poorly and live a life full of struggle, just like the man in front of her. Despite the pressure of life that left him breathless, he continued to persevere, wanting to provide a better life for his wife and family. Witnessing this scene, Jinju finally understood Bando's suffering. On the way back, Jinju kept thinking about this. When she reached the front of her house, she suddenly decided to meet Bando. Meanwhile, Bando was sitting alone, drinking to drown his sorrows, when suddenly his phone rang. After answering the call, he heard Jinju crying and asking where he was. Upon hearing Jinju cry, Bando anxiously asked where she was, then hurried to where Jinju was. At that moment, Jinju was waiting at a red light. A child, in an attempt to retrieve a ball, ran into the street. Seeing that the child was about to be hit by a car, Jinju rushed over without hesitation to save the child. As Jinju was about to be hit by the car, a figure immediately ran over and pushed her out of the way, taking the impact instead. That person was none other than Bando. Seeing Bando being hit by the car, Jinju rushed over, but no matter how much she screamed, Bando showed no response. Jinju, that in pain, pleaded and screamed for her husband to wake up. She was panicked, and Namgil took Bando to the hospital. At that moment, Jinju felt as if the sky had fallen. She sat on the ground, crying and in anguish, while Namgil, witnessing this, understood Bando's place in her heart. Fortunately, Bando survived the critical condition, but when Jinju went to visit him, he asked the nurse to refuse her entry. Despite this, Jinju stubbornly refused to leave and waited on the hospital bench. It was only when Bando's friends arrived that she could use the pretext of being a friend to see him. Seeing Bando in this condition, Jinju felt very distressed. That day she thought he had left the world, and in that brief moment, she was terrified, feeling as if every cell in her body had frozen when her mother passed away. Hearing this, Bando understood that Jinju was worried about him, so he reassured her that he was fine, as long as she was not injured. That would be the best fortune with him. Bandu knew he was not able to provide Jinju with a good life, but he wished for her to be safe and healthy. If they really couldn't return, Bando hoped Jinju would forget about them and start a new life, because he lacked the confidence to make her happy. Jinju then asked Bando what would happen to their child. Was he going to abandon his own child as well? To Bando, Jinju's place in his heart was even more important than a child who was just in his thoughts. Jinju didn't know how to respond. Later, while Bando was in the hospital looking at the rings on his hand, he felt a deep sense of guilt towards their child. He regretted his mistakes. Back at home, Jinju cried in her mother's arms throughout the night. If she chose her mother, she would lose Sojin, If she chose Seo-jin, she would lose her mother. This choice was indeed very difficult for her. Her mother could only hold her and offer continuous comfort. The next day, Namgil came to visit her at home, but she appeared in pajamas, which surprised Namgil greatly. However, Jinju was not in the mood to meet anyone or go out. But when Namgil mentioned that it was his birthday, Jinju couldn't bring herself to refuse, so she decided to go out with him to celebrate. Namgil took out a box of kimbap and told her that he had woken up early to prepare it. However, Jinju could immediately tell it was store-bought. Namgil said he had prepared it, not made it himself. Hearing this, Jinju didn't say anything further. She took a piece of kimbap and ate it, then started a day of fun with Namgil. Late in the evening, they sat on a swing and talked. After chatting for a while, they eventually shifted to the topic of mothers. When discussing this subject, Jinju couldn't help but recall the bitterness of raising a child. She had gone from being an inexperienced girl to forcing herself to become the strongest woman in the world. Such responsibilities and fears are common to all mothers, as in the end, a mother is just an ordinary person. Hearing these words, Namgil felt even more that Jinju was a warm and gentle girl, and was increasingly sure that he liked her. Jinju wasn't surprised by this statement. She stood up and walked over to Namgil, hugged him, and thanked him for liking her. It was Namgil who helped her realize that she was also a girl. But everyone has their own pain. For the love Namgil had for her, Jinju could only say sorry. For Namgil, this outcome was perhaps the most perfect ending. After returning home, Jinju sat and stared vacantly at the floor, but her mother suddenly opened the door, asked if Jinju wanted to have a drink with her. Jinju then sat with her mother and drank. At that moment, Jinju felt incredibly happy. She lay on her mother's lap, and her mother suddenly told her to go back to her child. Hearing this, Jinju immediately sat up. It turned out that while cleaning her room, her mother had accidentally come across a letter Jinju had written. When her mother opened the letter, she discovered the secret her daughter had been keeping. Looking at the contents of the letter, and remembering the unusual behavior before, she immediately understood everything. Reflecting on what had happened, although she was reluctant to believe it, she opened Jinju's diary, which listed the 5 things Jinju most wanted to do. In the past, the first thing was to go to a bar. The second was to bathe with her mother. The third was to go karaoke with her mother. The fourth was to drink with her mother. And the last was to say goodbye to her mother. Seeing that her mother had discovered her secret, Jinju don't know how to say. But then her mother continued, saying that Jinju could live without her parents, but parents could not abandon their child. Jinju cried uncontrollably as she hugged her mother one last time. This might be the greatest blessing of Jinju's time travel back to the past, because nothing is more precious than being with her parents. Meanwhile, Bandu, being in the hospital, saw other people's children and felt even more nostalgic for his own child. In the end, he chose to return to the future. He rushed to Jinju's house, running for a long time, and finally saw Jinju standing at an intersection. The first thing Jinju said when she saw Bando was, "Let's go home." Hearing this, Bando could no longer control his emotions. He went to her, then hugged her, and cried. After that, Jinju returned home, and her mother took her hand and said that if she went somewhere without her mother, she must take good care of her father. In fact, Jinju's mother was most worried about her husband. She was very afraid that if she left him alone, he would feel so lonely. Jinju also agreed with her mother that she would take good care of her father. In the end, Bando and Jinju sat together, put the rings back on their fingers, and shared a passionate kiss. The next morning, Jinju woke up to find that she had traveled back to the future. Seeing her little child beside her, she felt both joy and sadness. She was happy to see her child again, but sad to have lost her mother once more. Shortly after, Bando also returned home. The couple embraced their child and cried tears of sorrow as they felt a deep sense of longing. In reality, love is never absent in marriages. It is often obscured by the challenges of life. Only when couples understand and forgive each other can they break through the fog that hides their love, which is the truest form of happiness in marriage. Remember, love never truly disappears, and never wait until it's lost to regret. This concludes the film. Thank you for watching. You are the